At the core of all abuse, at the epicenter of every wound, there is a statement or series of statements that produces disease. There is an underlying belief, an underlying fear, an underlying shame that needs to be protected in some way that creates a vortice of reinforcing patterns, and the longer it goes on, the deeper the wound. And the real disease and the real abuse is the transferring of a message. You are not valuable. I am not valuable. This is part of the wound. It can also be, you are not lovable, I am not lovable. But it's a message that is being given beneath the behavior. So obviously when you rape someone, you're not saying, you are incredibly valuable. You're saying, my needs are more important than your needs. But you're also not saying, I'm incredibly valuable. Because an incredibly valuable person would seek something truly valuable, such as an earned, competent, trustworthy friendship with a highly trustworthy friend, whether it was sexual or otherwise. That is 10 times, 100 times more valuable than an unconscious or squirming rape victim who wants nothing but to get away. So within the wound is a dual message. I'm not lovable, you're not lovable. I'm not valuable, you're not valuable. And there's also the message within a reenacting wound that there's no help to be found, that there's nothing I can do about it. Because the person that says, I'm not lovable, but I can ask for help and I can grow and I'll be lovable next week, goes and asks for help. But the person that feels fundamentally unlovable, that if my incompetency shows, if my cruelty is revealed, if my cowardice is known, I will never be loved again, and so I have to hide it. Now you see this interesting spiral start to form, where it's very much like a lie. You tell one lie, but it doesn't match up with reality. So you have to tell 2 more lies to support the first lie. You have to keep changing reality to fit with the lie. And that ripples out indefinitely until you stop examining the lie, or until your entire reality is a lie. Because everything has this causal nature, and if you're trying to find the cause for something and follow it through, you have to turn your entire reality upside down just to support one falsehood, because everything exists in an ecological framework. So one of the things to examine in terms of understanding your reactivity, your sensitivity, and your response to a pattern of abuse, to a multi-layered wound, is to get a sense of how deep it goes. And also to get a sense of what's the core message that's been given to you. So one of the things that I heard very loudly is, your love isn't important. You are not valuable. You don't belong. You're not welcome. So these are messages that were very strongly consistent with the behavior of the abuse or of the abuser. And so what is the message beneath your pattern of abuse? And, you know, it can be, you're a bad person. It can be, you're not lovable. It can be, you're ugly and bad. but there's some view, there's some belief that motivates or that ties in with every pattern of abuse. And if that message is successfully transferred, meaning if you thought you were a valuable person and then you were raped and then no one protected you and then you were humiliated and gossiped around because you were raped, by the time the entire culture has participated in abusing you by not teaching women self-protection in high school, by not teaching men emotional literacy, by not lifting the chauvinism of sex equals value for men, by not doing anything to prepare you for a cult or a culture capable of supporting you in preventing the rape, in stopping the rape, in repairing the damage of the rape. If you are surrounded by incompetence at a cult level, the cult produces rapists, the cult produces unsafe environments in which rapists prey on innocents, the cult produces cowardly bystanders, the cult produces a sociopathic legal system that humiliates the victim, and the cult produces a public that when they hear about the rape does not know how to respond other than to shame the victim in one way or another. And then a therapeutic system that doesn't know how to heal PTSD to a large extent. And then a group of lovers who don't know how to respond to the natural byproducts of someone being raped. You've created an entire circle of incompetence surrounding one person who's been given the message over and over again, you're not valuable. You weren't important enough to include rape response in the therapeutic guidelines. So it just didn't come up. Your therapist didn't know how to deal with it either. Nor did they know that they didn't know how to deal with it, so they didn't refer you to a competent therapist. And again, the message, you're not important enough to prepare for, to respond to heal. The disease is successfully internalized at the point where you start to believe, I'm not valuable. I'm not valuable because if I was a valuable person, this wouldn't be happening to me. If I thought I was valuable, surely I would be preventing these layers upon layers upon layers of abuse. And if they thought I was valuable, surely they would be doing the obvious things to prevent, respond to, apologize for, and repair the abuse. But I'm not valuable enough for that. I don't value myself enough to figure out how to do that. My government, my cult doesn't value me enough to figure out how to do that or help others figure out how to do that. And my therapist, my abusers, my friends, my family do not know how to do it either. I must not be valuable. So what happens at this stage is the underlying message that is carried and lodged in the abuser gets given to a new victim. And now you share the wound, you share the disease, which is the underlying sense, the underlying fear, the underlying dread that I am not a valuable person. If I was, these things wouldn't be happening to me. They are happening to me. They are not respecting and reflecting value, therefore I am not a valuable person. That's where the destructive drilling begins. Because once you believe that you are not a valuable person, you will act consistently with the belief. For example, incest survivors, of which there are a great number in our culture, incest survivors that were not protected in childhood by anyone. Because for a 6-year-old to be fucked by dad in a family, Everyone has to willfully ignore the passive rage and the passive aggressive energy in Dad. All the neighbors have to ignore it. We have to agree to be blind. Well, that makes the child vulnerable. It doesn't say I'm valuable, feelings are valuable. It says that hiding the abuse is so important, we're going to commit to blindness at a systemic level. If someone in the family knows and doesn't do anything, there's another level which says that, okay, you guys have all gone to school. None of you have learned in school what to do about sexual abuse at home. Why not? Why is the abuser being protected at the expense of the child? And so one of the things that happens with incest survivors is they become prostitutes. They internalize the message that their value consists solely of their ability to gratify men sexually. And having understood that they have no value, their feelings have no value, and that their body only has value to the extent that it gratifies men who have no respect for who they are. Well, what's a good profession to reflect that belief? Prostitution in a cult that shames and looks down on prostitutes, and in which prostitutes are more likely to get disease, more likely to be arrested or be part of violent crime. If you believe that, then you start to act consistent with the belief, and that's where the real harm comes in. Your abuser can only abuse you so far in many situations, but you can abuse yourself for the rest of your life if you have adopted the message of universal incompetence as a reflection of your value. So it's what I want to establish with this video is that there is a pivot point. There is a turning process where the wound gets deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, as long as you are in relationship with the behavior pattern which is broadcasting the underlying message, you're not important, you're not lovable, you're not valuable, something along those lines. So I'll share a little bit of the beginnings of this process in what has been the most destructive adult pattern of abuse in my life, and kind of we'll take it to 8 layers of abuse, just as kind of a suggestion of that boring process down into violation and into an infection with this underlying thing. So in each level of here, you can look and say that there's a message below this behavior that says you're not valuable, and that says I'm not valuable. So, and this is a very important thing to understand, that the abuser overcompensates often by condescension, by arrogance, or whatever. However, the underlying message of that is that they are not valuable. Because, for example, for a therapist in this case, to destroy their career over all kinds of absurd ethics and abuses of protocol is saying my career isn't valuable. My career isn't valuable enough. I'm not valuable enough to really learn what I'm doing. But I'm going to do it anyway because I don't care. I don't care about you, the client, but I also don't care about me, the practitioner, and I also don't care about me, my career. And I also don't care about my family and the people around me, because everyone is affected by an abuse pattern. And as a general rule, they're not legal. Within the chauvinism of power, the higher you are in a power pyramid, generally the more you are protected in your abuse patterns, particularly if you're bringing a lot of money or something, to the power structure. But as a general rule, abuses are not looked on that favorably and are often illegal. So the abuser has to think that they have no value. You know, when dad fucks his little 6-year-old, he's putting the entire power of his life into the hands of a child because she could talk and people could believe her. And suddenly he's in prison, So this is the important thing to understand with this underlying message of value. It goes both ways. So dad has to say at some level, the fact that almost every incest survivor grows up with severe psychological scars for life doesn't matter. Crappy sex with a 6-year-old. What? You realize how insane it is for someone to say that crappy sex with a 6-year-old that is going to make me powerless and possibly end me in jail, and that is going to damage my daughter or my son for life. I mean, we're not talking about risking imprisonment with a highly trained, deeply competent, passionate, professional lover who's been doing this for 30 years and who knows how to, evoke all of the various things to be the peak sexual experience. Okay, I'll risk my life, my career, my whatever, my family for that. Inexperienced, poorly proportioned body, unhappy. We have a miserable assertion going on here that violent, shame-based, crappy sex with a 6-year-old is worth my whole life and career. In other words, I have no value. I'm worthless. I'm not even worth phenomenal sex. I'm worthless. And so are you, because you're a part of me. This is where, the parent that believes in their shame because a culture treated them as emotionally and psychologically worthless from birth. No emotional literacy, etc. So this is the message that's being given. And in the case of myself, with sexual psychological abuse, but with a male therapist under the influence of psychedelics, we have a number of different abuses going on simultaneously. The first is the transgression of the boundary of heterosexual and homosexual in an abuse cult that violates homosexuality, meaning there are still pockets of the United States where your safety levels go down and your humiliation level goes up. And you are in real danger for demonstrating your homosexuality. In an abuse cult that doesn't care about itself, it doesn't care about its minorities, it is afraid of the unknown. And so when you move someone towards homosexuality without adequate preparation to basically make the abuse impersonal, meaning as a minority in this culture, you will be targeted for unusually high levels of bias and abuse. Those are the statistics of an abuse cult that attacks its minorities. So when you move a client from heterosexual orientation towards homosexual orientation, you are not only bringing up the trauma in the body of understanding what you're dealing with on an instinctive level, having watched enough movies and heard enough horror stories to understand that you're positioning towards abuse. There's also the shame that the cult dumps on men for being feminine. And in the role of a younger male client and an older male therapist, the therapist is in the masculine role. They're in the leadership, initiatory role, and the client is in the feminine role. Well, in a cult environment in which men have been shamed for their femininity since birth, you are exposing them to a higher level of cult shame. If you do not process and give that back to the ignorance of the cult and unconsciously take it on, there's a sense of shame. The next thing that goes on is the statistics of therapeutic abuse. Well, there are no legal structures anywhere on the planet that encourage therapists to have sex with their clients. And the reason for that is it doesn't end well for the client. 99% of the time, if a therapist has sex with a client, the client loses a therapist because the therapist has just demonstrated their incompetency as a therapist, which means they also lose trust in therapists, which means they also have the humiliation of being blamed, because we like to blame the individual rather than the power structure around the individual for things that go wrong. And it's very unpopular to be considered a victim in the U.S. So if you were abused in a power dynamic, the obvious question is, well, why didn't you call the police? This is what's said to abused women. So in an abuse illiterate culture where people do not understand what the abuses are, in an abuse and illiterate culture where people do not understand what the abuses are, then you have a dynamic of, where the ignorance of the cult around you is foisted upon the victim at the last time they need to deal with that level of ignorance. But that's a form of abuse. And so when you don't understand the law of mass, which could also be called the law of power, which says that when you have a very large body of energy next to a very small body of energy and they interact, the smaller body of energy generally gives way to the larger body of energy. And if you don't have that, awareness of the levels of mass in power dynamics, so in a therapeutic relationship, the client will generally regress and be encouraged to regress, which means that they will psychologically become very young in parts of the relationship. Now, the younger you become in relationship with a power figure in your cult who's older and doesn't regress, the more of a power dynamic there is. And at a certain stage in youngness, when you're going through terror, you will do anything for a power figure in order to be kept safe, particularly if the power figure claims to love you. And so we don't even understand these dynamics. We don't understand regression, which is basic 101 psychology. But of course, we're in a chauvinist cult, so we don't teach anyone about it. So partly what I'm dealing with here is the many levels of ignorance where we're ignorant that we're ignorant, and that everyone else is ignorant that they're ignorant. But that in that ignorance is a message that says we as a culture, we as individuals, we as perpetrators and abuse survivors are not valuable enough to know these things. We're dealing with layer upon layer upon layer of abuse. And so when a therapist particularly under the influence of psychedelics. So in this case, the first abuse of my therapist came when he did not prepare adequately for the subject. He didn't do psychedelic sitting very much or at all, but he thought he could do a great job with it, and thought he could do a great job at full price at $175 an hour. So here you can see the first parts of the message. You know, if a group of passengers asked someone who'd never flown a 747 to fly a 747 and said, "I'm sure I can manage it," there's a message that 500 lives back there are not very important. I'll just wing it. And there's a message that I'm not very important. I'll just wing it. I'm sure I'll manage. So the abuse starts with the assumption that it's no big deal because we're just talking about the inner psyche. And, you know, any competent culture in human history, when dealing with psyche, would understand we are dealing with a vast infrastructure inside the self that is as significant and impactful as anything going on in the outer world, and needs profound respect and training. But the first abuse is, I don't value enough to develop competency in this area. And so this is a mutual abuse. And it's also an abuse in the culture at large, meaning the culture at large at a governmental level does not value the psyche enough to develop competent psychedelic therapies legally. So there's a violation and a message that you don't matter. Therapists have been talking about the potency of some of these compounds in therapeutic environments for decades. And they've been shut up with the message, you don't matter, we don't matter. You're not valuable, we're not valuable. We've got to suppress change. I don't value you enough to disclose my lack of competency ethics or get to know you. And I put particular emphasis on this because one of the biggest wounds in a chauvinistic culture is the pattern of men lying and saying anything they can to get into bed and have sex with women, who they then discard having gotten the sex that they wanted. And so, fine, I'll marry you, I'll do this, whatever. Just whatever I have to do to have sex with you, and then move on as if nothing had happened. And this, of course, has produced rage, irritation, pain, and a message of worthlessness for women for hundreds of years. And it's this issue of not being willing to get to know the person. It's the worthlessness of you're only valuable for a 5 or 15 minute distraction on a physical level. But I don't actually want to learn to see you, to know you, to understand you. We're not dealing with love from an adult, where I love you enough to care, I care enough to see, I see enough to understand, I understand enough to empathize. I empathize enough to attune, and I attune enough to succeed at playing a vital role in the facilitation of your self-realization, of your survival, security, love and belonging, self-esteem, and development of personal gifts, and integration of those gifts into the environment, and being a part of something bigger than the self. So this is adult love. But you actually have to love enough to care. And you have to care enough to see, which includes making the time to see. And so anytime you have an invitation into an intense vertical relationship where the person in the vertical position, in this case a therapist, an older male, is not wanting to see you, you don't have caring enough to see. And the question is, what earns them the right to have a highly influential position in your reality, in your psyche, if they do not love enough to care enough to see enough to understand? And so as I'm going into the most profound initiation of my adult life, my first full-on psychedelic experience, Peter Sandhill does not care enough to see, does not see enough to understand, does not understand enough to empathize, does not empathize enough to attune, and does not attune enough to succeed. And so rather than building the self-realization, he's imploding self-actualization and self-realization and charging money to reduce a human being's ability to fulfill their human needs. My ability to survive went down more than 50%. My security of survival went down 80%. My sense of love and belonging went down 80%. My sense of self-esteem went down 60%. My sense of my gifts and ability to bring those into the world went down 70%. My competence to bring those out into community went down 70%. My sense of transcendence and being part of something bigger than myself and in service to that went down 90%. So we have chauvinistic abuse after abuse after abuse, that rather than attuning to the individual and participating in the growing and individuation of that human being, leads to a dissent. And it is that dissent that holds the message of abuse. Because if you are not competent and you value someone, you value them enough to become more competent or refer them to someone else. The message there is, you're too important to be ruined. The message in a deep narcissistic abuse dynamic is, you're not even important enough to get to know, let alone protect from ruin. So you have no questionnaire. So Peter asks whether I'd like him to wear a normal shirt or a white shirt. That's the extent of the intake. And this is particularly striking in terms of an abuse, at the Human Awareness Institute, because several weeks earlier on the public forum at High, I talked about planning to commit suicide. And then I talked about psychedelics being a last-ditch effort, something I'd never tried and thought it would be a good idea to explore before taking my own life. And what's interesting is this gap where, and making, over-promising is part of an abuse dynamic, because over-promising and under-delivering makes me look good, but at your expense. And so, the Human Awareness Institute facilitators of their workshops talk about their commitment to into me you see, to seeing deeply into human beings, to loving, to making sure that every human being wins. So this is their mission statement. And so it's a hype, it's an over-promising, and yet you post on a public notice board that you're not only not winning, you're in so much pain in the context of their community that you're planning on taking your own life. And it goes unnoticed because, again, if the commitment was deep to winning, you would have actually given out surveys and asked people how many are winning and in what ways, and then you'd respond, because that's what adult responsibility looks like, is you respond. But so you have client announces suicide, leadership doesn't bother to read the notice. And then in this context, client reaches out to facilitate a sitter session. And, professional therapist does not do any intake other than, which kind of shirt do you want me to wear? And so you have an invisibility which ensures a certain level of abuse. Now, I fought the invisibility for 90 minutes. I even explained that a lot of therapy had been destructive, because I really wanted to impress on Peter that this could go badly. And his response was to ask, as I say, the one question, and then to push me to take 3 times higher dose than I was comfortable with for my first session with a sensitive body. So he knew, and what's interesting in the violation, and again, it's you're not worth knowing. You're not worth advocating for. Because I had told Peter multiple times that I had a very highly sensitive body. I mentioned a dream of being overwhelmed and swept off my feet, which was my guideline to go slow on the psychedelics. And I mentioned Asperger's-like tendencies. I mentioned my recent letter about suicide. So these are all things that bring up, this is an unusual circumstance to slow down and get to know this person and see before wielding influence. But Peter's response is, no. Trust me. I want you to take 3 times the dose that you're comfortable with, and I will be there for you in a way that no one has ever been there for you. I'm going to take an absolute commitment for your well-being. But of course, he's not checking his resources. He's not looking at how leveraged he is, because as it turns out, he's coming into this session with keeping secrets with his wife. And as the session proceeds, he's violating his agreements with his peers. And so he's saying, I'm not valuable, you're not valuable, you're not valuable, nobody's valuable. I'm going to expose everyone to harm. I'm not worth it, they're not worth it, you're not worth it, nobody is valuable. And this is the cruelty of a cult that raises men with no sense of value. This cult produces men with no sense of value. And if they don't have any value, why would they value someone else? Professionally or otherwise, why would you value someone else? And so there's no preparation. I don't value you enough to expose my incompetence. And if you're a hairdresser learning to cut someone's hair, you usually do it for free or for $5, because the message is, you're valuable. Your hair is valuable. It's way more valuable than a few bucks. And so if I want to practice on you, I've got to do it for free, or, thank you for the chance to learn and acknowledge I don't know what I'm doing. And so but Peter Sandhill's attitude is, you need to pay me to learn at your expense, even if that means abusing you. Why? Because you don't matter. Because you do not matter. And so there's always, because you're not valuable. And when I had a real panic attack around that, what Peter's next level of abuse was to tell me to ignore my fear and believe his promise, and push to take more psychedelic substance for my first experience than I was comfortable with. Now, this also is a fallout. See, this abuse wouldn't happen with a trained psychedelic sitter. And the reason for that is no psychedelic sitter or therapist will bludgeon a client into a terrain that the client is not ready and willing to go. That's not respect. It's not honor. It's violation. And so what you can see is that the abuses compound. So it starts out with Peter isn't valuable enough, and the people around him aren't valuable enough to prepare and train. Otherwise, he would have read the books before offering to do a paid session. Then it continues with pay me full price even though I don't know what I'm doing. But because I don't know what I'm doing, I'm going to abuse my influence to actually push you in the opposite direction of your well-being. I'm not going to make it better for you. I'm going to abuse my authority. And so I want you to ignore your fears about me and believe me, not your feelings. So it would be very healthy if someone wants to have sex with you or wants to totally change your life or have a profound therapeutic relationship, and they don't want to understand you and get to know you in any way, it would be incredibly healthy to say, get the fuck out of my life. Of course, it would be very healthy for a cult to teach its children this in middle school and high school, when many of us are being abused. But these feelings, you want to have a profound impact on me without even understanding me? You're a sociopath. You're a moron. Because in a professional capacity, if you hurt me, you hurt yourself. And if you haven't figured that out, you don't even care about yourself to know what you don't know. So you have layer upon layer upon layer of compounding abuse. So Peter pushes through these fears and makes a promise, which turns out to be an abusive promise within the first hour. So he says, I'm going to take a rock-solid stand for you. He said, remember Gandalf on the path in Moria with the Balrog behind him? And Gandalf is there saying, you shall not pass! And the bridge breaks. Like, this is Peter Sandhill, right? The adult, going to be there for his client. You can count on me. So I do. So this is me abusing myself. Because it sounds like value. And this is, I guess, the sugarcoating and where this insanity dynamic is so dangerous. It sounds like value. It sounds like value. But the promise was a lie before it began. And anyone who does anything with energy work, with martial arts, etc., knows that you've got to have a strong container, a strong center, before you can extend influence with any effectiveness. Well, Peter Sandhill, as he disclosed to me in his next round of abuse, failed to tell his wife that this was a psychedelic session, deliberately concealed that from her, because he thought it would be easier and less complicated if she didn't know what he was doing. So, your marriage is your most important container. Now, if you split your marriage in order to go do something, you've just halved the amount of container that you bring to the situation. You've weakened yourself prior to arrival. Lies weaken you. Betrayal weakens you. Broken marriage weakens you. But it's more complicated than this, because Sarah Sandhill is my high facilitator in workshops. with a commitment to a world where I win, with facilitator agreements that her husband is breaking, which puts her in an ethical quandary. Do I protect my husband or my client? So Peter is dividing a therapist and a client by making his wife choose between his betrayal of her and whether she should betray the client and join her husband in the abuse dynamic. And Sarah was also a therapist of mine. So betray your participant, your student, your therapeutic client, or gang up on the client, to protect your husband's unhealthy behavior of betraying you. You see how sick this is? So Peter's promising this solid container while he is destroying any solidity or integrity that could provide such a container. And he's also asking his client to weaken himself and to participate in the weakening of that marriage. And he does it like this. He doesn't say, do you mind carrying a secret? He doesn't say all the therapeutic guidelines suggest do not bring your dysfunctions in your marriage into your therapeutic relationship. What he says is, I didn't tell Sarah that this was a psychedelic session because it's less complicated that way. And this rang a bell because when he was trying to encourage me to take MDMA with him 10 years earlier, Sarah was not happy about the situation. Sarah was not happy that he was expressing sexual interest in his client. Sarah was not happy that he was suggesting doing illegal activity in her house. Sarah was not happy that Peter was suggesting that he take MDMA with his client after expressing sexual interest and discussing his erection with his therapeutic client. She was not happy about this. So Peter's way around the fact that his wife and fellow therapist would protest his abuses was not to tell his wife, and then to divide and destroy the trust between wife and client still further by making the client complicit in the betrayal while the client was high. So Peter pushed for the high dose, promising this solid container. And then once his client is high and influenceable, uses this vertical position to make his client a secret keeper in his marital betrayal, which is revealing on some level to the client, this is a maniac who doesn't know what they're doing, and my session is just beginning, which leads to elevated fear, which Peter never owns in terms of it's never about him. There's nothing about him to be scared of, right? So if you're scared, it's because you have problems with fear. This is the equivalent of driving down on someone with a 10-ton truck and being about to kill them. And then they scream, and the truck driver is saying, oh, you have problems with fear. Rather than, thank goodness, you've got instinctive survival things that would help you jump out of the way of my incompetence. So I want you to trust me and ignore your fears about me, which means to distrust yourself. Now so in order to go along with the higher dose that he's pushing, you have to distrust the self, which is actually in a healthier place. So now the trust is moving away from the healthier place to the incompetence of the therapist, which is weakening and it's increasing the probability of more abuse. And I actually, having never lied to a lover or cheated on a lover in my entire life, I found myself wondering, while high, because you're very suggestible, if maybe that was the solution. Because a lot of women have been angry at me for telling them the truth in ways that, they don't want to know. They've often told me, you don't have to tell me this stuff. Don't tell me and I won't be upset. It's like, no. If we're going to have a relationship, you're going to know what's going on. And if you don't like what's going on, then we should stop having a relationship. Let's not have a relationship based on lies and secrecy and denial. Let's have a relationship based on whether we can actually see and accept who we are. Or let's not have a relationship. But this is not very popular in the United States with the amount of promiscuity that our cult is breeding. But I remember wondering if maybe this was the answer. If my therapists were lying to each other to avoid the terrain that they didn't want to have to work out together, maybe that was the solution. Maybe that's why I wasn't in a committed relationship, is like so many people are saying, I was too honest. And that's the way, so that's another layer of abuse. The message of I as a therapist with another therapist practice lying to my wife as a way of getting what I want, I guess. But there's also a message in there that you don't matter. Because Sarah had protected me and her husband 10 years earlier from his stupidity and his abuses at that time. And because she protected him by bringing a healthy dose of concern and reality, he just responded by not including it. In other words, you value our family more than I do. I'm willing to risk it all. Hey, fuck with a client, give them drugs, charge them money, explore a sexual relationship. This whole house may be going down, but I'm willing to risk it because I'm not valuable. But my wife is saying, no, you are valuable. Your career is valuable. I'm valuable. This family is valuable. Your client is valuable. Don't fuck with it. So his response is, okay, I'll just do it on my own secretly. Because it's not that big of a deal. I don't matter. My client doesn't matter. My family doesn't matter. And this is hidden, of course, by arrogance and superiority. That I'm sure this is not the conversation going on in Peter's head. But the arrogance and the superiority says, oh, I've got this. I can figure Sarah out. I know what's good for her. I don't need to include her. You've got tremendous arrogance. Where does that come from? When it's laced with so much habitual failure. Meaning Peter Sandhill has failed time and time again in these arrogant ventures of his, whether it's ruining their finances by day trading or whatever. This is the same arrogance. I'm not worth becoming competent, and I'm damaging an entire system. And that's that. So there's a deep lack of value beneath all of these actions. So I want to make you a secret keeper with your own therapist. I want to charge you money to give you a secret because you have to pay me for all of these abuses because you're not valuable, because I'm not valuable. The data about sexual relationships doesn't matter. The fact that 99% of the time if a therapist escalates a sexual relationship, let alone under the influence of psychedelics, it is a disaster for the client. The client loses trust. A therapist deals with confusion. What's wrong with me? Why am I paying for sex? Because the therapist will often keep charging a client if they can get away with it. Which creates an imbalance. So this is a form of abuse to allow that to happen, because he's stoning me out of my mind for a first psychedelic experience so that I can't hold container for what's good for me. So that means that's his job. But let's just throw years of, and decades of therapeutic protocol and ethics and data out the window and just wing it because I know best. So you have a certain arrogance in that. I know more than the whole therapeutic community. I know more than my wife. I know more than all my colleagues at High. You have a tremendous superiority at the expense of the client. Your feelings of usury don't matter. This started to come in as, and it was interesting. In the first few moments of the session, I told Peter that how he had abused me 10 years prior had really hurt me. And this just bubbled out of my mouth as the psychedelic was coming on. And I didn't fully understand what I was saying, of course. And that's the value of a psychedelic session, is you get to explore what you're hiding from yourself. So I was hiding this from myself, and I was hiding it from Peter, so it bubbled up. So good job. The psychedelic is doing its job. But Peter has a conflict of interest in a paradigm of, you're not valuable enough for me to do my job. And so rather than doing the therapeutically ethical thing to do, which is to say, tell me about that, I'd like to apologize, and I'd like to understand how I hurt you. And I'd like to not do that again. And I'm sorry. And if it proves that I've been faulty, I'd like to give you a refund because I don't believe in you paying money to be hurt. Because you're valuable. See, that's what someone who values themselves and values the client says when a client says, you really hurt me 10 years ago. But that's not Peter Sandhill. Peter Sandhill said that he's ready to be done with that now. Because this is his session, right? He's paying $175 to work on his issues in the way that he wants to work on. So, of course, it should go by whether he's ready to move on or not whether his client is ready to move on. He's only the therapist, after all. Why should he have to listen to the ways that he systematically violated his client 10 years earlier? Why? It's no fun. Let's change the subject to something more comfortable for me. Because you don't matter, and my career doesn't matter. So you have the chauvinism of not only not asking, but glossing over and dismissing key opportunities where the client is doing a better job than the therapist of navigating these terrains. And the client is being fought by the person they paid money to get help from. And so you have a tremendous amount of hurt, shame, and abuse being given over and over and over again. Your feelings of usury don't matter. Once the relationship became romantic and sexual under the influence of both psilocybin and MDMA, two drugs that are predictable for that type of situation, I asked Peter to stop charging me for the work. This came through spontaneously multiple times, and it wasn't a rational ethics, because we don't bother telling our citizens what therapeutic ethics are. We just say, go to therapy, and we trust the therapist to know what they're doing. But when many of them don't, then it's left to the client to kind of intuitively feel out what's right. And in this case, felt very, very wrong to be paying Peter Sandhill for a love affair. But he fought me tooth and nail on that, because your feelings don't matter. But the other thing that's interesting is the degree of intensity and confidence. So Peter is doing his normal thing of just, oh, sure, that's fine, this is what I'm doing, etc. And it's all based on this premise that without any training or competency, etc., that he knows what he's doing and he knows better than you. That's why you should take more drugs than you want to take. That's why you should keep this secret. That's why you should give up this topic. That's why you're wrong about this. That's why he should charge you for a love affair, because he knows better than you. And there's a consistent arrogance and confidence in this whole presentation that leads to the next wave of abuse. Why is it that every time I advocate for what I think is healthy inside, I have to fight with my therapist? The person who obviously knows what they're doing, or I wouldn't be paying them $175 an hour. Now, if they don't know what they're doing, why am I paying them? But since I'm paying them and they obviously know what they're doing, what's wrong with me that every time I put forth something, I'm getting fought, except if it's an unhealthy suggestion? And this is a very interesting split. So when I'm trying to talk about feelings, we're not going to do that. When I'm trying to respect physiological boundaries, we're not going to do that. When I'm trying to bring in intimacy and awareness, no big deal. When I'm asking not to charge for a prostitution love affair, no, that we're not doing that. When I'm talking about his blind spots, no, I don't have any blind spots. That was another wave of abuse. But if I say, kiss me while high on MDMA and psilocybin, oh, sure, no problem. So you have a very interesting dichotomy where the only thing that is supported are the unhealthy aspects of the situation. And everything healthy in me that's trying to advocate is being turned into an enemy by the person that's supposed to be protecting that. So you have the message, you're crazy because your therapist is arguing with anything healthy about you and is supporting what's unhealthy. So it's a very backwards dynamic, which is confusing therapy. It's letting the client know that therapists abuse the customer. And so this is what it looks like and feels like. And, having made this Gandalf-like stand, for being there, absolutely, I'm going to protect you. Peter is the only therapist in the history of $140,000 of therapy who broke every guideline in one fell swoop for the integration session. So within 24 hours of making this promise to be there absolutely, we're having our first integration session, which I've said is it's really big deal to have this container. Peter doesn't show up. He doesn't communicate that he's going to be late, and he doesn't answer calls for 20 minutes. He doesn't show up. He doesn't say he will be late, and he will not respond to calls. Now, here's the person who pushed me into 500% more destructive and unknown terrain in my first psychedelic session. And waiting for me on the other side, if this doesn't work, is suicide. Because it's the one therapy I haven't tried. And he's the only therapist among 40 practitioners to be late without saying they're going to be late, and to be late without saying they're going to be late and not answer Skype, cell phone, or home phone, and just leave the client hanging after the most precipitous event in their entire adult life. Now, this was so far abreast from the "you shall not pass." This is so inconsistent with Peter making the biggest promise that any male has ever made to me. I'll risk my life to stand on the pass and fight the Balrog to keep you safe. Trust me. But within 24 hours, the very first session, etc., I can't even be bothered to show up or communicate, you realize there's schizophrenia. You realize you're in deep water with someone who is completely incompetent. So I had a fit. Now, Peter Sandhill charged me $175 an hour to spend an hour talking about how upset I was. That far from, being some new vision of a male actually keeping their promises, etc., that he was such a moron that he couldn't show up for the first appointment for money. We're not talking about risking your life or anything. We're just saying show up, collect your miserable $175 for stuff you don't know how to do, and just show up on time. Is that too much? It's too much for Peter. It's too much. But it never occurs to Peter Sandhill that he's 7 layers deep in abuse at this point. And the best thing is to apologize and take all the shame and the incompetency back and say, you need a real person who can deal with this because I don't know what I'm doing. It never occurs to him. He clings to the money as evidence that he knows what he's doing. He can't face the fact that he's a moron in these terrains. And so he refuses over and over and over again to stop charging. And he charges me money to have these discussions. And I don't know what to do at this point because I am very dissociated from this session. I'm in love with the man for the first time in my life. And I've got early childhood attachment disability, which means I need certainty, but Peter's fighting that certainty. I've got a highly sensitive body, which means that all these emotions and things are really affecting me. And my therapist is at war with the truths inside me that he doesn't want to deal with. And so this goes on for another 20 layers of depth, which is why it's the most significant layer of abuse in my life. The thing that I want to illustrate, because I don't have a formula that I can give you exactly, but what I can tell you is that abuse patterns compound. So the first abuse is you were not cared enough to be seen. But then the next wave of abuse is inevitable because you will always abuse what you don't see clearly. Always. It's a statistical inevitability. If you do not see the other person clearly, you will violate them whether you want to or not because you don't know what you're doing, because you don't know what you're seeing. So the abuse of not seeing becomes the abuse of violation. The abuse of violation, that is not seen, leads to symptoms of abuse. The symptoms of abuse, when the violation was not seen, are not understood and so are abused. For example, when a parent traumatizes and terrifies a child, and then they become hyperactive because that trauma wasn't de-escalated, and then the parent hits the child because they're distracting them with their hyperactivity, and then the child becomes depressed and collapses, and then the parent humiliates the child for being depressed and collapsed because they're being violated again and again and again by a misogynist giant in a cult that doesn't teach competent parenting. Now the child feels worthless and unloved because every symptom they express of the chronic spiral of abuse is attacked over and over again by the abuser who is unwilling to own the shame of their incompetence, and so is passing the message again and again and again. It's all your fault. It's all your fault because I'm too scared. I'm too fundamentally unlovable. I'm too threatened by the truth to let this get near me. So I, the giant, will dish out the wound to the child. And if you follow the grave of the wound, our cult is a master at burial. So first it hides the truths that would allow us to anticipate a wound. Buries that truth. Next, it hides the data of what the wound is. Buries that truth. Next, it wounds you and calls it a non-event or calls it love and buries it. Then there are symptoms from the wound. Blood starts pouring out, for example, if you stab someone multiple times in the chest. But the blood is shamed. Stop getting blood on the carpet. I can stab you all I want, but if you're bleeding, make sure it's not on the carpet. It has nothing to do with me. Why are you bleeding? So you have the insanity and the dissociation that the symptoms of the wound are not honored or connected with the wound and are not healed. They are instead shamed and punished. Now, when you shame and punish the symptoms of the wound, you will predictably create pain, shame, rage, rebellion. It can be pouting. If there's helplessness, it can be self-mutilation. So when someone then expresses this level of response to the sustained abuse, then they are again looked at, why are you cutting yourself? Don't do that. You're a bad person. So shamed for being shamed, for being shamed, for being shamed. And in a cult that on the one hand denies children all psychological data, we're just not going to study the most important subjects in human history. We're going to study algebra, which you're never going to use a day in your life. We could study psychology, which would be significant in every single relationship you have with yourself and others, but we're not going to, because we are committed to a cruel level of ignorance and stupidity that reflects the chauvinistic dogma that says that the inner self doesn't matter. We're committed to cruelty and stupidity. And so then the child is left feeling dumb for behaving predictably simply because they are surrounded by morons who cannot grasp the connection between the child's self-inflicted harm, etc., and the parent's consistent multi-leveled violation, mirroring the cult's consistent multi-leveled violation. So then they have to hide who they are so they don't get shamed, which is another form of abuse. I have to hide who I am because you're too dumb to understand me and too committed to hurting me when you see me. That's another abuse. And then because I'm invisible, I feel unloved. And because I'm unloved, I feel unlovable. Now the abuse is deeper. And because nobody figures it out, I feel clear that nobody really wants to know. And because people are scared if they get glimpses of certain parts of me, I again figure they'd rather not know anything than really face their fear of their own stupidity and cruelty. So it just goes deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into loneliness. Now we've got the symptoms of being lonely. But then people say, cheer up. Why should I be cheerful about being lonely? Well, you're not lonely because those events never happened because you never told anyone and we're too dumb to figure it out. So it just goes on and on and on and on. And every deterioration, every disease can develop a series of co-infections that can kill you off more effectively than the original wound. So, the problem with these psychological deteriorations, which mirror immune deficiency diseases, is that we destroy the immune system, the trust in the self, the validation of what's healthy, in one layer after another, after another, after another. And then we use that vulnerable immune system to pass a very destructive virus. You don't matter, you're not lovable, whatever it is, and have that ripple through the system. And that's what often kills the individual, through suicide, through addiction, through shortened life, through just tuning out and stopping feeling. And so the purpose of this is for you to get just a general sense of the landscape here, so that you can start mapping out your abuse. And so that you understand that you're sane for seeing this terrain. And so that you understand that at least one individual understands a little bit of what you're dealing with. And that this is likely to be the most difficult work that you will face in your lifetime. And it takes great courage and bravery to face and deal with these dynamics. And blessings to you for having the guts to hang in there. We need people like you who are not swayed by the chauvinism, by the cruelty of the cult, to actually see some of this work and begin helping those more vulnerable. Children are left with multi-level stuff like this. And then we execute our young boys when they act out these abuses towards others, right, without ever diagnosing, the 10 or so levels that we systematically destroyed everything decent in them and enabled everything pathological.